Hello, everyone. This is Chapter 7 overview. Chapter 7 focuses on the inequality within the United States and primarily focusing on wealth, but also, I think it's important to also consider that along with wealth inequality, that also means that there are inequalities in healthcare, in education, etc. Those types of inequalities will be covered in subsequent chapters. And so I wanted just to make it clear that when we think about the structure of inequality in the United States, it's important for us to keep in mind it isn't just the wealth, but those other factors as well. As I said, we'll see those in subsequent chapters. So just thinking about the differences in the way people live, it's easy to understand the inequality pictured here in this slide. Clearly, the person who lives in the home on the right is living in comfort, living in a nice home. I don't think any of us would necessarily turn down living in a place like that. On the other hand, on the left-hand side of the page, or of this slide, you see the homeless individuals who, it's a black and white photo, so you can't tell that much, but it looks like there might be some snow on the ground. It also, obviously they appear to be living outside in the elements, which cannot be an easy thing for anyone. And I don't think there are a whole lot of people who have a roof over their heads who would say, hey, let me switch with a homeless person. Let me go and experience that because it seems like a great experience. Obviously, not a whole lot of people would say something like that. And those who do, maybe would be joking. So first off, let's think about what does social stratification even mean? Well, for sociologists, when we think about stratification, we think about division or ways in which society is separated into different groups. And these different groups, of course, are arranged hierarchically, so that there are people at the bottom, people in the middle, people at the top. Of course, we recognize that wealth is only a piece of the picture, that in addition to where people are in that hierarchy, there are also other factors that may stratify people, things such as race, class, as well as gender identity, sexual orientation, ability, physical ability, mental illness, etc. There are many ways that we put people into different groups, and of course, in any society, including this one, there's a different value placed on people depending upon which group they're in. And my guess is that some of you already have on some level experienced the type of value that people in the United States put on one group or another, because some of you may be in those groups that are devalued, and others are likely in groups that are valued. Social inequality, so the stratification is about the hierarchy, the ladder, if you will, in terms of people at the bottom, in the middle, and at the top. Social inequality, though, is where we look more closely at the distribution, the unequal distribution of things such as wealth, power, and even prestige among people or different groups in society. Wealth, most of you have a great idea of what this is. It just very simply is the accumulation of everything that a person or a family has to their name that is worth something. So, of course, it could include real property, can also include personal property, things like cars and jewelry and fine art, etc. But it's everything that you have that is worth something. So Even things that you might not think of as being um, worth something. Things such as, oh, let me fix this a bit. Things such as your furniture, your clothing, your laptop, your phone, all of those types of things are worth something. Now, obviously, some people have a lot of wealth, others have much less wealth, and there are lots of people in between. Power uh, is about being able to get people to do what you want them to do. Remember, we looked at that in one of the chapters last week. And so clearly, some people have more power than others. I'd argue people in Congress have more power than some of us. People who have a lot of money, I'd argue, have a lot more power than people who don't have a lot of money. And prestige. Prestige is interesting because it often is intangible, meaning that you can't see it and touch it. But it's prestige is the level of respect and admiration that people within society give to someone based upon who they are. And often that is tied to status. So somebody who has a very high level job probably has a lot more prestige than somebody who has, say, a service job, working as a janitor or in fast food, etc. So prestige, as I said, is not something we can see and touch, but it's something that we feel that other people get that maybe we may not get, or maybe we get that maybe someone else doesn't get. Okay, so let's see. All right. One of the earliest forms of slavery, and I don't mean in the US, I mean around the world, one of the earliest forms of stratification was slavery. And unfortunately, humans find a lot of ways to be cruel to other humans, and slavery is one of those ways. I'm certain that all of you have studied slavery at some point in your K through 12 years, so I won't go into a lot of detail here, but I just want to note that it is one of the oldest forms of social stratification. People who were slaves and people who were the enslavers. A caste system is another type of system of stratification. The only country that in more recent history had such a system was India. And officially, the country abolished the caste system. I'm not quite sure how long ago, but I know that it was abolished officially by the government. People are no longer limited in terms of who they can marry and where they can go to school, where they can live, all of those things, because caste determined your whole life under that system that India once had. However, I spent a month in India back in the summer of 2015, and what I learned from talking to people there is that, yes, officially, there is no longer a caste system. However, unofficially, it still exists. Very much how I think, very similar to how in the United States, discrimination is illegal, and yet it still exists. People still find ways to treat people differently because of how they look. And the same is true in India. People who are lighter skinned, this is one of the ways in which people were put into castes or identified by the government as belonging in certain castes. People who were lighter skinned were of much higher castes than people who were darker skinned. So again, common thread here in the United States as well. Apartheid, another example of a caste system. Apartheid was used in South Africa between 1948 and 1991 when it was finally abolished, and Nelson Mandela, a man who had spent many years in prison because he was trying to abolish apartheid, with the help of lots of other people, of course. He was leading the charge. And so he was imprisoned for his political views on a place called Robben Island for most of those years. It's an island off the coast of Cape Town in South Africa. And again, I've been fortunate to travel to South Africa a couple of times and visit Cape Town, as well as Pretoria and Johannesburg, as well as, some of the animal preserves there, like Kruger National Park, etc. But in my travels there, again, talking to people who are both white South Africans as well as Black South Africans, who are the majority, what I found was that um, same thing with the U.S. It's officially apartheid no longer exists, and of course it doesn't. You aren't you aren't relegated to where you can live and what kind of job you can have like you used to be officially. However, people still find ways to hire people who look a certain way or people who have a certain background. Discrimination, I'd say, is alive and well in just about every country that I've ever visited, whether it's because of race and ethnicity or something else. Humans are good at that. We're good at discriminating against others just because they're different. We're really, really good at that. So let's focus on social class, because I'm going to touch on some of the more important concepts, and trust that you're going to read some of the things that I'll quickly mention and say you should read this. First off, social class. Social class is a term that not only sociologists use, but also historians and anthropologists, economists, political scientists, many different disciplines use the term social class. And for us as sociologists, we think of social class as being a system of stratification that is based on wealth, property, power, prestige. I'd even add opportunities in there. And so we usually say SES, which is just an abbreviation for socioeconomic status. But we're really talking about social class. But we think of socioeconomic status as more than just how much wealth you have, but really all of those other factors that are listed there. Intersectionality is another really important term, and this is a newer term. We probably started talking about this in the mid-1990s, but it's an important one because the recognition is that none of us are just a single thing. That is, I'm not just a female. I am many things. I have many identities. And so intersectionality really is focused on this idea that intersectionality plays a huge role in not only our experiences within this country, but also in terms of our opportunities in this country. And so intersectionality is, as I said, really just this recognition that we have many different identities, not just one, not even just two. You may think of yourself as a person of color or a Caucasian person. You may think of yourself as straight, or somewhere in the LGBTQ community, you may think of yourself as non-binary. You may think of yourself as gender fluid, etc. You may think of yourself as of a particular religion or not. You may think of yourself as agnostic or atheist. What I'm trying to point out is that we all have multiple identities, and that is that intersectionality that I'm talking about. You can think about it as all of our identities are woven into one another, and so you can't really just separate them and say that this identity is more important than that identity. Some people might be able to say, well, this is my most important identity, but not everybody can. I can't say that. If somebody were to say, tell me which of these identities is your most important one, being a female or being a Latinx person, then I'd say I can't. because both of those things are very important to who I am and how I identify. So I can't just separate them and say, well, this is more important than this. And some of you may know what I'm talking about. Others of you may not necessarily have that experience. All right, so here's the part where I'm going to trust that you're going to read in more detail about the different social classes in the United States, because there's a lot of detail there, and so I don't really feel the need to go over that in detail. I want to spend more time going on some of the other going over some of the concepts that I think are not always easy to grasp. This is easier to grasp, I think. Okay, hold on. Let me go back here. Okay. All right. So let me go through here again. All right. That's again the social class ladder that I was talking about. Okay. So I want to pick up with the theories. And I'm sorry if you hear that in the background. That's my cat ruining furniture. Conflict theory. Conflict theory, remember, is focused on the idea that there is that constant struggle between those who have and those who don't. And so for conflict theorists, and remember, conflict theory, based upon what you learned in chapter 1, is largely based on Karl Marx's writings. Of course, lots been added to it since then, but that's the foundation. So if you remember anything from chapter 1, what you hopefully remember is that Karl Marx was very critical of capitalism. He thought it was the root of all the evil that he was seeing in industrializing Europe when he was living. And so when Marx studied it, he identified what he thought were three classes. Three different social classes within society at the time that he was living. And the two that we'll focus on, although I will mention the third one, the two are the capitalists, or what he called the bourgeoisie, which is French, simply, well, best translation is the capitalists, people who own the means of production. And the means of production when he was living were the textile mills and the steel mills and the mines, etc. And the workers, or again, his term, the proletariat, the people who sold their labor for wages, the people who did the work inside those textile mills and factories and mines. The middle group, he didn't really find too much of a problem with them. He called to them the petite bourgeoisie. And the petite bourgeoisie, in his view, were the small business owners. These were the mom and pop businesses, or the businesses that individuals had. So, the doctor who made house calls, that was his business, or her, well, actually it was only his business back then. Or the milliner who had a shop and made hats, or the baker, maybe the husband and wife who owned a bakery and they made baked goods and sold them out of a shop. Or maybe the blacksmith or the carpenter who did their own, work for themselves, made things for individuals and got paid some way. But he didn't think these people were very problematic for this reason. He said many of these people are working for themselves, or it's a small family business. And people who are working within that small family business are family members, and family members are less likely to take advantage of other family members. And so his focus really was on the capitalists and the proletariat, or the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, the capitalists and the workers. What Marx pointed out about capitalism was that the primary tenets of capitalism sorry about that. The primary tenets of capitalism are, one, to maximize your profit above all others, right? And if we're honest, that's probably why most of you are getting a degree, or completing your prerequisites to transfer, or to get into a nursing program, or some other type of program. It's because you want to make more income. than what you would if you didn't have any education. And I say this because I'm pretty sure, like I didn't feel this way when I was in college. I didn't get 3 degrees or earn 3 degrees because I just loved learning so much. Of course not. I had been told, led to believe that if I got a degree, then I would be better off than my parents were. And my parents were immigrant farm workers, so I thought, well, that sounds really good. I should get a degree. And then while I was completing my bachelor's degree at Stanford, I learned about their master's program and thought, well, I can get a degree, a master's degree in sociology, and that'll be even better than just a bachelor's. And so while I was completing my master's degree at Stanford, I was asked by a advisor why I didn't think about law school. And I thought, well, geez, if 2 degrees is good, then maybe 3 degrees is better. And then while I was in law school in my first year, I somebody put somebody I met who worked in the business school put it into my head that, hey, you know what, you could actually get your JD and your MBA in this 4-year dual program. And so I applied to that and I got in. I didn't finish the business degree because I began to realize, okay, this is getting silly. I'm just collecting pieces of paper without really understanding why I'm doing that. And I didn't like the MBA program. But again, my point here is that most of us, we want to maximize our profit, which is, again, one of the primary tenets of capitalism. Marx, though, believed that that was one of the harmful parts of capitalism. Because he said what happens is that the capitalists, in their zealousness to make as much money as they can, maximize their profit, then they will mistreat the workers. They will not pay them enough. They will, if somebody gets injured, they'll just fire them and hire somebody else. There was no vacation pay, no sick leave. There were no breaks. There were no lunch periods. If an employer gave that to you during your 10 or 12-hour shift, great, but it was not required. No health benefits, none of those things existed. And so what that meant was people typically worked 6, sometimes 7 days a week, 10 or 12 hours, and they got paid very, very little. And so what Marx believed was that eventually the workers would recognize that they had one thing that the capitalists didn't have, and that was numbers. They'd realize, the proletariat, the workers would realize that they were larger in number than the capitalists. There were far more workers than there were capitalists. And so he believed that eventually they'd realize that they had power in numbers. They'd refuse to work for such ridiculous wages, and then the capitalists would have to change their ways because they'd have no workers. Okay, sounds good. Sounds like it should work. However, unfortunately, workers don't always see what's in their own best interests. And so unions did begin in the mid to like from the 1850s through the 1870s. They really did begin to form and continued into the 20th century, and they still exist today. However, the people who own the means of production, the capitalists, were often able to prevent people from unionizing because there were no laws that said people have the right to do this. That changed in the early part of the 20th century with the National Labor Relations Act, the NLRA. However, unions began to get weak again in the 1980s when Ronald Reagan came along and said, well, I'm going to fire all these airline pilots who are refusing to go to work because we need flights to get off the ground. And it was upheld. And that was the point at which we started to see that unions began to decline in power. So, however you feel about unions, Marx believed that that was what was going to happen. He also believed that at some point the workers would be able to overthrow the capitalist system and implement something better, which he called socialism. Of course, it didn't happen the way he thought it would, but there's your conflict theory. Okay. Now, Weber. Max Weber had his own idea about social inequality. And Weber, you remember that, well, you may not remember this, but I do. Weber and Marx were contemporaries, meaning they lived at the same time. In fact, um, Weber, if you remember Max Weber from um, chapter 1, or maybe it was Marx, no, it was Weber. Weber actually um, died of Spanish flu in 1918. Um, so anyway, Weber had his own idea about what was going on in the United States, and we call it Weberian theory. And remember, his last name is Weber because he was German. And so what Weber said is that it's not, it's not just about how much money you have. We also have to look at some other things too that together make up where someone is in this social hierarchy, what we're calling social class. And so he said, sure, wealth is part of it. How much wealth you have, how much money, how much property, how many things, jewelry, fine art, etc. How much you have of that, sure, that's part of it. But there's power as well, which, remember, is the ability to get other people to do what you want them to do, as well as prestige. Prestige is, remember how we, the respect and the level of respect and admiration that we give to people just because of who they are. And so for Weber, his argument was, look, it's these three things that really make up where a person is in the social class hierarchy. And I think most of you would agree that his idea from the latter part of the 19th century is still very relevant. I mean, it's still very true. All right, so let's see. You can take a look at that chart. Functionalism. Remember structural functionalism. Functionalism is really focused on the idea, remember, that if something exists in society, it exists for a reason, as well as this idea that there are all these different parts of society, and these parts all work together. So for structural functionalists, when they look at social stratification, they argue that in many ways it is actually beneficial for societies to have some degree of social stratification. Now, they're not necessarily saying as much as we see in the United States, but it's necessary to have some degree of social stratification. So how? Why? Why are they arguing this? Well, hold on a minute. I'm going to... Okay, so here's how it works according to the structural functionalist theorists. One way that stratification is beneficial to society is this idea that, not everybody's going to be a doctor in society. And we don't just need doctors in society. We need people to do all kinds of jobs. We need people at the lower end of the of the jobs, of how jobs pay. We need people who will be janitors and work fast food. I mean, obviously I'm updating this idea. Fast food, people who will clean houses, and people who will do landscape work, etc. We need people in the middle. And so that means we need some people who have some degree of training or skill. So maybe supervisors and managers, etc. And we also need people who have some college degrees. So maybe people who are engineers and architects, etc. And maybe we need people who have professional degrees like doctors and lawyers. And actually, I should have put architects in there because they have to take a series of tests. But we also need people who are nurses and school teachers, etc. We need people at all levels with varying degrees of education. And school is not for everyone. And so, according to structural functionalist theorists, people will fall into the job for which they have the skills and the education. And that, of course, means that all of the different needs of society will be fulfilled. Another argument is that, and this isn't in the text, but one that I think is relevant, is that people have a choice, right? In fact, we're really big on choice in the United States and this idea of freedom. People are free to choose how much education they want to get, or how much they're willing to work toward earning. So some people maybe will drop out of high school. That's fine. They made that choice. They can go and get a job that doesn't require anything more than, some education, but no high school diploma or GED. Some people will choose to go to a community college, get an AA in something or some certificate, and they'll go and get a job that's consistent with that certificate or AA that they earn. Other people will get that AA or go directly into a four-year school, and those who go to AA maybe transfer to the four-year school. At some point, some people will get to a four-year institution where they'll earn a bachelor's degree, and they'll go out and they'll get the jobs that are consistent with the degree. Other people will go beyond that, and they may get a graduate degree of some sort, a master's or an MBA. Others will go to professional school and get a JD or a dental degree, or any number of doctorate degrees. The point is, people have a choice, and based on their choices, then they fall where they do. And of course, one thing that furthers this argument is that people are not locked into the choices they make. So somebody who drops out of high school could decide, hey, I'm kind of tired of these manual labor jobs, so I'm going to go ahead and go to a community college and earn an AA, and then from there I'm going to transfer, or maybe I'm going to just get my AA. But there are choices there, right? Nobody's locked into the choices that they make at 16, 17, or 18. Another idea for why social stratification is beneficial, say structural theorists, is that we have to give some people greater rewards. That is, we have to pay doctors and lawyers and people who get degrees and graduate degrees and additional training and have to pass tests in order to practice or be in that profession. They deserve more pay, and so we have to give them more pay, because if we don't, then who's going to become a doctor or a lawyer if they're only going to get paid as much as a police officer? Very few people would, and so goes the argument, unless they really, really want to help people, say. But most people would not. Okay, so that's the idea. Pause this real quick again. Okay, so that's the functionalists' argument about how social stratification might be helpful to society. And then finally, well, no, not finally, because we've got to do symbolic interactionism. There is one theorist, it's considered a postmodernist theory. His name is Pierre Bourdieu, and he is a French sociologist. He has posed this idea that people or families tend to reproduce their social circumstances. Essentially, this idea that families pass on their advantages to their children and grandchildren, etc. Of course, it works the other way too, and that is that families pass on their disadvantages to, from one generation to the next. And so his argument is that really social class, if you look at where people come from, their backgrounds, people who are wealthy typically have come from wealthy, educated backgrounds, and people who are poor typically have come from those types of backgrounds, undereducated and poor. And notice how I said undereducated. It's not that they are uneducated, it's undereducated, meaning that they didn't receive a quality education. And so if you think about your own family, you might consider that maybe Mr. Bourdieu is onto something. You know, if you look at your family's history, maybe your family has always had wealth and education. Or maybe your family's been in the middle somewhere. Some people have it, some people don't. Or maybe you're in the other camp where most of the people in prior generations were undereducated and did not have much wealth and didn't have a whole lot of opportunities. There seems to be something there. At least I think so. All right. One of the things that Bourdieu points to is cultural capital. What he means by that is these are the things that we learn within the social environments that we're in, whether it's from family, friends, school, etc. But we learn certain tastes, and by that I mean, you know, what we like in terms of food or styles of dress or movies or art, etc., music. We learn certain habits, how we eat at the table, how we speak, etc. The expectations that people in our families have for us. We learn certain skills or certain knowledge from our social environments, and that can help some people gain an edge in society. Of course, it can also present somewhat of an obstacle to others. And I'll just give you a quick example here. When it comes to cultural capital, when I was a first-year law student, quite a few of the people in my section of 100 students, they had family members who were lawyers. If not their parents, then their grandparent, a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle, or, you know, somebody in their family line was a lawyer. So they already knew quite a few of the legal terms that we were learning in our first year of law school, because they'd heard them. They'd heard them in conversation, or they'd heard them and asked a question, or they'd read it and asked a question. And so that kind of cultural capital was helpful to them in that first year of law school. So cultural capital can advantage us or even possibly disadvantage us, depends on which social environment we're in. Symbolic interactionism. This is the fourth idea here that's important. Thinking about symbolic interactionist theorists, remember that they typically are really interested in how we interact with one another in groups based upon our identities. And so for symbolic interactionist theorists, they're really interested in how status is used by others to define us, and therefore to treat us according to how they perceive us in regard to our status. So just think about how we tend, even without wanting to, we all do it, we tend to judge someone as being from a wealthier social class background or a poorer social class background or somewhere in the middle, based upon things that are readily visible to us, things such as styles of dress, you know, or how someone speaks, whether they speak English perfectly or not quite there, or whether they speak it with an accent, etc., by the gestures that the person uses, by what they have, you know, what kind of phone they have, what kind of sunglasses even they have, what kind of car, you know, different possessions, who their friends are, as well as the activities that they engage in. So somebody whose family, you know, during summer, their big trips are to the beach on the weekends. Maybe people, upon hearing, oh, that's what they did all summer, was they went to the beach a number of times. Somebody else went to Hawaii, or, you know, went to, I don't know, the Bahamas, or, you know, someplace in the Caribbean. All this information gives us this idea that we know who these people are, and so it leads to us perceiving them in a particular way, which then leads to us treating them in a certain way. One quick example of this is, and there, probably none of you will know who this is, was. He's long dead. His name was Howard Hughes. He was what would have been a billionaire at the time, very wealthy man. He liked to dress, dress down. You know, he liked to dress as a laborer, or as a worker, as someone who had much less wealth than himself. And he liked to do that because he wanted to see how people would treat him, because he knew how people treated him when they knew who he was. And so when he went into a restaurant, or he went, to a bar or something, and the person didn't recognize him, um, then he'd see how this person treated him. And he was known to leave very large tips, which, $100 I know is not as much today, but in the 1940s and 50s, $100 was a lot of money. He was known to leave $100 tips to people who treated him well, despite the fact that he wasn't dressed very well at all. So I think you can get the sense of what Goffman is talking about, um, because we all do it. I'm sure some of us have, thought, oh, that person is, wealthy. And then we find out, oh no, they just act wealthy. They just try to dress in a wealthy way. They try to speak in a wealthy way, but they're not really wealthy. Or that person's poor, and then we find out, no, that person actually has a lot of money. Okay, so just, something to consider the next time you see someone who's different from yourself, and you make perceptions about that person. You never know. You could actually be wrong. I'm trying to move that and it won't move. All right, well, moving on. All right, so one thing that I really want to impress upon you is this, what is increasingly becoming a fact. In fact, recent research was published, I think it was around 2016, by the Opportunity Foundation. It's becoming increasingly clear that which social class you're born into has profound consequences for opportunities in your life, and of course your life experiences, as well as even your lifespan. How long you will likely live. For example, when it comes to um, longevity, that is how long a person lives, or life expectancy. People, no surprise, it shouldn't be a surprise here, people who are born into wealthier families typically live longer than people who are born into poor families. Well, that's pretty obvious why that is. Obviously, the wealthy individuals, the wealthy family, have better access to healthcare. And not just better access to healthcare, but better access to better doctors, to better hospitals than somebody who's poor. They also have better access to healthy foods, organic foods, grass-fed beef, all the stuff that we focus on today. They're also less likely to eat junk food than people who are poor. And there's an obvious reason for that. And that's in one of the videos that I put into the module for this week, where it follows the video. It's just a quick one. Just take a quick look at it. Follows 4 kids. I think it's 4 kids who live in South LA, and their experiences with living in a food desert. How do you get fresh food when there are no big grocery stores near you, and the corner liquor store may have some fruits and vegetables, but not ones that many of us would probably want to eat. Also, of course, when it comes to education, the wealthier a family is, the better education they can pay for. The rest of us are left with what we can afford, which is typically public school. Also, the kinds of work that we may aspire to, and the kind of income, of course, that type of work will bring. I often think well, I do think that this is true. I think it's really difficult for students who come from lower income families, undereducated families. It's really difficult to dream of being something that you've never seen or even heard about. Here's what I mean by that. When I was a kid, as I've mentioned, I am number 7 of 9 children in an immigrant Mexican family. Parents were farm workers originally. If somebody had said to me, one day you should go to law school and become a lawyer, when I was in elementary school, middle school, even high school, I didn't know what the hell a lawyer was. What is a lawyer? I didn't know any lawyers. My family never had, or maybe we needed one, but we just didn't know. We never used a lawyer. what's a lawyer? You know, I could look it up in the dictionary, but that still doesn't tell me shit. I didn't know what a lawyer was. And so even by the time I was in college and decided, I'm going to go to law school, I had a vague idea of lawyers because, Thurgood Marshall, first Supreme Court justice, and he was the one who had argued the Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas decision. So I had a vague idea. And then I went to law school and I realized, oh, wow, geez, nothing that I knew prepared me for any of this. That's what I mean by it's difficult to dream of doing something when maybe you've heard of what an architect, maybe you've heard of the term architect, engineer, etc. But even then, do you really know what it entails? Even just think about engineers. There's so many different kinds of engineers. All of them focus on something different from the others. And same thing with law. There are so many different fields of law. All of them focus on a different part of the law than the others. So criminal justice is one last thing I'll touch upon, and that is access to not only private attorneys, but also how we are treated within the criminal justice system. Somebody who's poor, who's a poor person of color, who shows up in jeans and the best button-down shirt we can find, will not be viewed by a jury in quite the same way as someone who shows up in a business suit. It's just doesn't happen. We all like to believe that juries can be unbiased, and yet they are not. So socioeconomic status really does influence one's life chances. Okay, so the idea of social mobility, I think, is well discussed in the text, so I'm not going to focus on that, but you should. Oh, I did it again. All right, there we go. Sorry. All right. Just really want to touch on poverty briefly. I did put a few videos. As I said, one of them was the food desert one. Also, homelessness in the U.S. is the discussion for this week. So just think about this. The poverty threshold for a family of 4 in 2019 was $25,750. Okay, now I'm going to hope that you guys can see this here on the screen. We're going to put this 25,750, and we're going to divide this. And by the way, this is pre-tax, so it really is actually less than this. But we'll just take. I'll go back here really quickly. 25,750 divided by. All right, it didn't clear it out. Okay, sorry about that. Try one more time. Third time's a charm. 750 divided by 12 for 12 months is 2145. But remember that I said this is before taxes are taken out. So if you take the 2145, we'll just take 2145 for ease. 2145. Now you've got to subtract taxes because everybody pays taxes. Well, I don't here in Nevada, but you do. I don't pay state income taxes on any money I make in Nevada. I do pay income tax on the money I'm earning from PCC because it's a California job. Anyway, you got to pay Fed taxes, you've got to pay state taxes, and you've got to pay FICA. You've got to pay SSI, Social Security, or SSDI, Social Security and Disability Insurance. You've also got to pay Medicare, the Medicare tax. So I've counted at least 5 taxes you have to pay. There might be, SUI, State Unemployment Insurance, which is separate from SSDI, so at least 6 taxes. So this isn't a lot of money per month, at least for a full-time person. Would be if you're part-time. So I'm going to take out roughly 10% here, somewhere around 12%. 10 to 12%. It really would depend on how many dependents you have, but let's say 10, 12%. That'd be 214, and then maybe take out a little bit more. So let's take out 250. And to make it better, we'll just go 245 for the taxes. Okay, so now it's 1900. All right, now here's the thing I want you to consider, particularly those of you living in the LA area. That isn't going to even pay your rent. Maybe in a studio, maybe, but you know, I have a mother-in-law who lives in East LA, and for a 2-bedroom, 2-bath, they pay $1,600 a month. So let's assume that you could get a 2-bedroom, 1-bath in East LA somewhere for $1,600. That leaves you $300 for the rest of the month for everything else. You can see why that low number is ridiculous. No one, I mean, maybe if you live in, I don't know, someplace where the cost of living is way less, like maybe in Nevada, where you don't have to pay state income tax and the cost of living is cheaper. Maybe you might be able to scrape by on 19, but for most people, they're going to have to get another job, or they're going to have to try to get TANF, which is Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, or WIC if they have young children, women, infants, and children. Maybe they'll have to go to food banks. They're definitely not going to be shopping at Whole Foods or stores similar to that, Bristol Farms and Pavilions, etc. They're going to be shopping at Grocery Outlet and 99-cent store, and they're not going to be eating all that healthfully because they can't afford it. And again, you can see why this is just ridiculous that we expect people to live on this kind of an income. And remember, if you make above that, let's say you make $26,000 a year, 28, 30,000 a year, you don't qualify for any of the things that I mentioned: TANF, WIC, Section 8 housing. What you do qualify for, of course, are food banks. In fact, you know, I've heard because of COVID, many people were able to get an increased level of unemployment. And the suggestion has been that the reason why so many people don't want to go back to work is because they are lazy and they just would rather get the extra income. But the reality is, if somebody is better off on unemployment than if they are working, then that tells me that those jobs pay too little. They're not paying a living wage. That's my thought. You can disagree with me if you'd like. So that's my overview for Chapter 7, and I'll see you in the Chapter 8 overview.